Before I'm a slave, I'm a man. These words, whispered in the darkness of a cramped slave quarter in Southampton County, Virginia, belonged to Nat Turner, a man whose faith would ignite a firestorm that shook the foundations of American slavery. It was August 1831, and while the slave-holding South believed its system of bondage was eternal and unshakable, one enslaved preacher was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. This is not just a story about rebellion. This is a story about how unwavering faith in divine purpose can transform an oppressed individual into an unstoppable force for liberation. How one man's spiritual conviction freed not just bodies, but minds, and how a single day of relentless courage changed the course of history for millions trapped in poverty and bondage. Nat Turner was born on October 2, 1800, on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia, owned by Benjamin Turner. From his earliest years, Nat was recognized as exceptional. His grandmother, who had been brought from Africa, told him he was destined for great things, pointing to marks on his head and chest that she said indicated he would be a prophet. His mother reinforced this belief, telling young Nat that he was too intelligent for slavery, that he was meant for something greater. These early affirmations planted seeds of purpose in a child who might otherwise have been broken by the brutal reality of his condition. Southampton County, where Nat lived his entire life, was typical of the rural South in the early 19th century. The economy depended entirely on agriculture, primarily cotton and tobacco, which required intensive manual labor. Enslaved people outnumbered free people in many areas, creating constant anxiety among white residents about potential uprisings. The legal system was designed to maintain absolute control through terror. Enslaved people who resisted could be whipped, branded, mutilated, or executed. Teaching them to read or write was illegal. They could not gather without white supervision. They had no legal rights, no recourse against abuse, no hope of legal freedom except through the rare act of manumission by an owner. Yet somehow, against all odds and prohibitions, young Nat learned to read. He was deeply religious even as a child, spending hours studying the Bible that he somehow gained access to. He became known among both the enslaved and free communities as a preacher, someone who could read and interpret scripture, someone who seemed to have a direct connection to the divine. His first owner, Benjamin Turner, allowed him unusual privileges because of his intelligence and religious demeanor. When Benjamin died, Nat passed to his son Samuel, then after Samuel's death to Thomas More, and finally to Joseph Travis after Moore's widow remarried. Through these ownership changes, Nat's reputation as a preacher and mystic only grew. Nat experienced visions from an early age, which he interpreted as messages from God, calling him to a great purpose. He would see visions of white and black spirits battling in the sky, of blood dripping from corn stalks, of hieroglyphic symbols written in leaves. In 1825, he had a vision in which the Spirit spoke to him directly, telling him that the great day of judgment was approaching and that he should prepare himself for a great purpose. He withdrew from other enslaved people, spending long hours in prayer and fasting, waiting for a clear sign of what God wanted him to do. His faith was not the pacifying religion that slaveholders preached, emphasizing obedience and heavenly rewards for earthly suffering. Nat's faith was apocalyptic and revolutionary, centered on the belief that God actively intervenes in human affairs to overthrow injustice. If you're captivated by this story of faith and courage that changed history, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories of liberation to light. In February 1831, Nat experienced what he believed was the definitive sign. A solar eclipse darkened the sky, and Nat interpreted this as the signal he had been waiting for. The Spirit, he later testified, instructed him to take up the fight against his enemies with their own weapons. The meaning was unmistakable. He was to lead a violent rebellion against the slave-holding system. Nat confided his plan to 4 trusted men: Henry Porter, Hark Travis, Nelson Williams, and Samuel Francis. They began planning carefully, setting a date of July 4th, which they saw as grimly ironic, given that enslaved people were excluded from the freedom that date supposedly celebrated. But Nat fell ill, and they postponed the rebellion. The final sign came on August 13th, 1831, when the sun appeared bluish-green, another atmospheric phenomenon that Nat took as divine confirmation. He set a new date: August 21st. On the night of August 20th, Nat and his core group of conspirators met in the woods to finalize their plans. They shared a meal of roasted pig and brandy, and Nat outlined the strategy. They would begin at the Travis household, where Nat was enslaved, then move systematically from plantation to plantation, gathering weapons, horses, and recruits. The goal was to capture the county seat of Jerusalem, Virginia, seize the armory there, and create a stronghold from which to launch a broader liberation movement. Nat's plan was audacious, but not irrational. He knew that successful slave rebellions in Haiti and elsewhere had begun with surprise attacks that seized weapons and momentum before authorities could respond. He believed that if they could demonstrate that resistance was possible, enslaved people across Virginia and beyond would rise up. Most importantly, he believed with absolute certainty that God had commanded this action, that divine providence would guide and protect them. This faith was not blind optimism. Nat understood the risks. He knew they would likely die, but he believed their sacrifice would light a fire that could not be extinguished, that their faith and courage would inspire others to claim their freedom. In the early hours of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner and his band struck. They entered the Travis household silently, and Nat attempted to kill Joseph Travis with a hatchet blow, though he initially only wounded him, and another conspirator finished the act. They killed the entire Travis family, including an infant, sparing no one. This brutality was calculated. Nat believed that showing mercy would undermine their momentum, and that the violence of slavery could only be answered with violence. They gathered weapons and horses and moved to the next plantation, their numbers growing as they freed enslaved people and recruited those willing to join the rebellion. Over the next 2 days, Nat's group moved through Southampton County, attacking plantation after plantation. Their numbers swelled to between 50 and 80 fighters. They killed approximately 60 white people, not discriminating between cruel slaveholders and those considered more humane. Nat's logic was that all slaveholders were part of an evil system, all benefited from bondage, and therefore all were legitimate targets in a war for liberation. The speed and ferocity of the attacks created panic throughout the region. White residents fled to towns for protection. Rumors spread of a massive uprising involving thousands of enslaved people, and the militia was called out in force. The rebellion began to falter on the second day. When Nat's group attempted to attack a larger plantation, they encountered organized resistance for the first time. The militia had mobilized, and armed white men were now actively hunting the rebels. Nat's forces were scattered in several skirmishes. Many fighters were captured or killed. Nat himself narrowly escaped and went into hiding, hoping to regroup and restart the rebellion. But it was too late. The element of surprise was gone, and overwhelming force was now arrayed against them. The response to Nat Turner's rebellion was swift and brutal. Hundreds of enslaved people were killed in retaliation, most of them completely innocent, having nothing to do with the rebellion. White mobs roamed the countryside, executing any black person who seemed suspicious. The militia and vigilante groups committed atrocities, beheading victims and displaying their heads on stakes as warnings. The violence was meant to terrorize the entire enslaved population into submission, to make clear what happened to those who dared resist. Trials were held, and dozens of captured rebels were convicted and executed. Their bodies were often dissected by physicians, or their remains used to make leather goods, a final desecration meant to demonstrate total domination. Nat himself remained at large for more than 2 months, hiding in the woods and swamps of Southampton County. During this time, he survived on what little food he could scavenge, living in a hole he dug beneath a pile of fence rails. He later described this period as one of constant prayer and reflection, not regret for what he had done, but contemplation of what it meant and what would come next. He believed he had fulfilled God's purpose for him, that the rebellion, despite its military failure, had achieved something important. He was not fleeing to save himself, but remaining in the area, hoping for another opportunity to strike. On October 30th, 1831, Nat was discovered by a local farmer and captured without resistance. He was imprisoned and interrogated. During his interrogation by lawyer Thomas Ruffin Gray, Nat spoke freely about his motivations, his visions, his faith, and his complete lack of remorse. His testimony, recorded by Gray and published as The Confessions of Nat Turner, provides extraordinary insight into the mind of a religious revolutionary. Nat explained that he believed he was an instrument of divine judgment against the sin of slavery, that God had commanded the violence, and that he would do it again if given the opportunity. He expressed no sympathy for his victims and no fear of his impending execution. Nat Turner was tried on November 5, 1831, convicted and sentenced to death. On November 11th, he was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia. His body was flayed, beheaded, and quartered, with parts distributed as souvenirs and warnings. His skin was reportedly made into purses and his bones taken as trophies. This savage treatment of his remains reflected white society's absolute terror of what he represented. An enslaved person who refused to accept bondage, who claimed religious authority to challenge the system, who organized others and took action, and who showed no remorse or submission, even facing death. Nat Turner embodied everything slaveholders feared most, but killing Nat Turner did not kill his impact. News of the rebellion spread throughout the South, carried by newspapers, letters, and whispered conversations among enslaved people. The story grew with each retelling. For white Southerners, it confirmed their worst fears and led to increasingly repressive laws. Virginia and other Southern states passed even stricter slave codes, making it illegal for enslaved people to assemble for worship without white supervision, banning the education of enslaved people entirely, and severely limiting the ability of free black people to live and work in slave states. Some whites, who had been ambivalent about slavery, now saw it as a system that required constant vigilance and brutal enforcement to maintain. But among enslaved people, the rebellion had a different meaning. It proved that resistance was possible, that enslaved people could organize and strike back against their oppressors, that they were not helpless victims but potential agents of their own liberation. The rebellion demonstrated that the system was not as secure as it appeared, that it was vulnerable to organized resistance from within. And Nat Turner himself became a legendary figure, a man of such faith and courage, that he had dared to do what millions dreamed of, strike directly at the heart of slavery itself. His memory sustained hope and inspired future acts of resistance, both open and hidden. The faith that motivated Nat Turner was complex and troubling. He believed God had commanded him to kill, including killing children. This raises profound theological and moral questions that have been debated ever since. Was Nat a prophet or a fanatic? Was his violence justified as response to the violence of slavery, or was it an unforgivable crime, regardless of circumstances? Could his faith be both genuine and deeply problematic? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're important to wrestle with because they get at fundamental issues about religion, violence, oppression, and liberation. What's clear is that Nat's faith gave him the courage to act when others could not. It provided a framework for understanding his suffering and the suffering of his people as part of a larger divine drama. It offered hope that justice would ultimately prevail, even if not in his lifetime. It connected him to a tradition of prophetic figures who challenged earthly powers in the name of divine authority, and it sustained him through the rebellion itself, through his time in hiding, through his trial, and through his execution. He died believing he had done God's will, that his actions had meaning and purpose beyond the immediate failure of the rebellion. We're now halfway through this powerful story of faith and rebellion. If this account of courage and conviction is resonating with you, please show your support by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with others who need to hear about the ways faith has driven the fight for freedom throughout history. The immediate effects of Nat Turner's rebellion were increased suffering for enslaved people across the South. The harsh new laws made their already difficult lives even more restricted. The violence of the reprisals killed hundreds of innocent people. In these ways, the rebellion seemed to have made things worse rather than better. This is the tragedy of revolutionary violence. It often harms the very people it aims to liberate before it can achieve its goals. Nat understood this risk and accepted it, believing that long-term liberation required short-term sacrifice. But that's cold comfort to those who suffered the consequences. Yet the long-term effects were more complex. The rebellion forced white Southerners to openly debate slavery in ways they had avoided. In the Virginia legislature in 1832, there was serious discussion of gradual emancipation, the only time such a debate occurred in any Southern state legislature. Though the proposal failed, the fact that it happened at all showed that slavery's defenders could no longer simply take the system for granted. They had to actively defend it, to develop elaborate justifications, to invest more resources in enforcement. The rebellion had made the maintenance of slavery more expensive and more morally complicated. The rebellion also influenced the abolitionist movement in the North. While some abolitionists condemned Nat's violence, others saw it as the inevitable consequence of the violence inherent in slavery itself. William Lloyd Garrison, the prominent abolitionist, wrote that the rebellion was a natural result of enslaving human beings who naturally desire freedom. Frederick Douglass later praised Nat Turner as a hero who had the courage to act while others merely talked. The rebellion made clear that enslaved people would not wait indefinitely for gradual emancipation or voluntary manumission. They would seize freedom by force if necessary, making the question not whether slavery would end, but how, peacefully or violently. For the enslaved community, Nat Turner became a folk hero, despite the terrible retaliation his rebellion had provoked. Stories about him were passed down through generations, often embellished but always centered on his courage and faith. He represented the possibility of resistance, proof that enslaved people were not passive victims, but human beings with agency who could and would fight for freedom. Every subsequent rebellion, escape, or act of defiance stood in the shadow of Nat Turner, drawing inspiration from his example even when pursuing different tactics. The spiritual dimension of Nat's rebellion cannot be separated from its political dimension. His faith was not an add-on to his revolutionary activity, but the very foundation of it. He did not arrive at the decision to rebel through secular political analysis or philosophical reasoning about human rights. He believed God spoke to him directly through visions, that divine authority superseded any earthly law or moral prohibition, that he was acting as an instrument of divine justice. This kind of religious motivation has driven many revolutionary movements throughout history, from the Jewish zealots fighting Rome to Islamic resistance movements to Christian liberation theologians in Latin America. The danger of this kind of faith is that it can justify terrible acts by claiming divine sanction. If God commands something, how can it be questioned or limited? Nat believed God commanded him to kill, and he followed that command without hesitation. This is why religious fanaticism, regardless of the tradition, can be so dangerous. But the alternative question is equally difficult. In the face of systematic dehumanization and violence like slavery, what kind of resistance is legitimate? If enslaved people have no legal recourse, no possibility of peaceful change, no way to negotiate their freedom, are they morally obligated to accept their bondage? Or do they have a right, even a duty, to resist by any means available? Nat Turner chose violence, and that choice had consequences both liberating and tragic. He freed no one in the immediate sense. The rebels were all killed or captured, and conditions for the enslaved worsened. But he struck a psychological blow against slavery, proving it was vulnerable, inspiring future resistance, and forcing a national conversation about the morality and sustainability of the system. In this sense, his faith did free many from slavery, not in a single day, but over the decades that followed, as his example and the fear it provoked contributed to the growing crisis that would eventually culminate in the Civil War and emancipation. The question of whether Nat Turner's actions were justified remains contested. From one perspective, he was a terrorist who murdered innocent people, including children, and provoked retaliation that killed hundreds of innocent enslaved people. From another perspective, he was a freedom fighter responding to the terrorism of slavery itself, striking back against a system that routinely separated families, raped women, worked people to death, and killed those who resisted. Both perspectives contain truth, and the tension between them reflects the moral complexity of revolutionary violence in situations of extreme oppression. What's undeniable is that Nat's faith was genuine and deep. He was not a cynical manipulator using religion to justify personal vengeance. He spent his life in prayer and study of Scripture. His visions began in childhood, long before he conceived of rebellion. He believed with absolute certainty that God had chosen him as an instrument of judgment, and he accepted the cost of that calling, including his own death. This kind of faith, unshakable conviction in divine purpose, gave him superhuman courage and determination. It allowed him to plan and execute an extremely dangerous action, knowing it would likely cost his life. It sustained him through months in hiding and through his execution. The poverty that enslaved people endured was not just economic, but spiritual and social. They were stripped of their African names, religions, and cultures. They were forbidden to read or gather freely. They had no legal family bonds, no property rights, no control over their own bodies or labor. This comprehensive dehumanization created a poverty of dignity and agency more crushing than material poverty alone. Nat Turner's rebellion, even in its failure, addressed this spiritual poverty by asserting the full humanity and agency of enslaved people. It said, "We are not animals or property. We are human beings made in God's image, and we will fight for our freedom regardless of the cost." The impact on poverty in the material sense came more gradually. The rebellion and the fear it provoked contributed to the growing tensions between North and South that would lead to the Civil War. The war resulted in emancipation, which ended the particular poverty of enslavement, though it did not immediately create economic security for freed people. But it was a necessary first step. Without freedom, there could be no possibility of economic advancement. Nat Turner's rebellion was one of many factors that made slavery unsustainable, that pushed the nation toward a crisis that would force the question of bondage or freedom to be resolved. The legacy of Nat Turner in African American culture is complex. During the Jim Crow era, when black people again faced systematic oppression and violence, Nat was often invoked as a symbol of resistance. During the civil rights movement, some activists embraced his memory, while others emphasized the non-violent resistance of leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s particularly celebrated Nat Turner, seeing him as someone who refused to beg for rights or appeal to white morality, but instead took direct action. The debates about his legacy reflect broader debates about the role of violence in liberation struggles. In 1967, writer William Styron published a controversial novel called The Confessions of Nat Turner that imagined Nat's inner life and motivations. The book was both praised and heavily criticized, particularly by black intellectuals who felt Styron had distorted Nat's character and motivations, depicting him as sexually frustrated and confused rather than as a clear-eyed revolutionary. The controversy highlighted how much was at stake in how Nat's story was told, who got to tell it, and what lessons were drawn from it. The historical Nat Turner left relatively little direct testimony, so he has become something of a blank screen onto which different political and ideological perspectives project their own interpretations. What we can say with certainty is that Nat Turner was a man of profound faith, who believed that faith required action, that God sides with the oppressed, and that divine justice sometimes requires human agents willing to sacrifice everything. His rebellion failed in its immediate objectives, but succeeded in demonstrating that enslaved people could organize, fight back, and terrify their oppressors. It proved that the system of slavery rested on force and fear, and that when enslaved people overcame their fear and employed force themselves, they could threaten the entire structure. This was a lesson that could not be unlearned, and it helped create the conditions for eventual abolition. The day of the rebellion, August 21st, 1831, did not immediately free anyone from slavery or poverty, but it set in motion a series of consequences that contributed to the eventual overthrow of slavery. It exposed the fragility of a system that claimed to be natural and permanent. It inspired hope among the enslaved and fear among slaveholders. It forced a national reckoning with the moral and practical sustainability of slavery, and it created a martyr whose memory would sustain resistance for generations. In these ways, Nat Turner's faith and courage did help free many from slavery and poverty, not through a single miraculous intervention, but through the slow, grinding process of historical change that his actions helped accelerate. The theological questions raised by Nat Turner's rebellion remain relevant today. What is the relationship between faith and violence? Can violence ever be divinely sanctioned? And if so, how do we distinguish between genuine divine command and self-justifying delusion? What responsibilities do people of faith have when confronting systematic injustice? Is peaceful resistance always morally superior to violent resistance, or does that depend on context and what peaceful options are available? These questions don't have easy answers, but Nat Turner's life forces us to grapple with them seriously rather than retreating into comfortable platitudes about faith and peace. For enslaved people in the years following the rebellion, Nat Turner's example provided both hope and warning. Hope that resistance was possible, that they were not powerless, that others had fought and would fight again. Warning that resistance came at terrible cost, that the forces arrayed against them were powerful and ruthless, that any attempt at liberation might fail and result in even worse oppression. This tension between hope and fear shaped the enslaved community's ongoing negotiations with the system that held them in bondage, informing decisions about whether to resist openly, to escape, to engage in subtle forms of daily resistance, or to endure and survive as best they could. The ways that faith sustained the enslaved community extended far beyond Nat Turner's apocalyptic visions. The spirituals they sang contained coded messages about escape routes and rebellion. The preachers who emerged from their ranks, some licensed by white churches but many operating in secret, provided spiritual guidance and community leadership. The ring shouts and other African-influenced worship practices maintained cultural continuity and provided emotional release. The biblical stories they focused on, Exodus above all, provided a narrative framework for understanding their suffering as temporary and their liberation as inevitable, if not imminent. Faith was survival, resistance, hope, and community all rolled together. Nat Turner's particular form of faith, mystical and violent, was not typical of the enslaved community as a whole. Most enslaved people did not experience the kind of visions Nat reported, and most did not believe God was calling them to violent rebellion. But many shared his conviction that slavery was contrary to God's will, that liberation was both a spiritual and earthly goal, and that faith required action rather than passive acceptance. The diversity of ways that faith manifested in the enslaved community, from Nat's armed rebellion to the Underground Railroad to the creation of independent black churches after emancipation, shows that there was no single black faith tradition, but rather multiple ways of being faithful in the face of oppression. The poverty that Nat Turner and his followers sought to overcome was comprehensive. It included material poverty, lack of basic necessities, and security. It included legal poverty, total absence of rights or protections. It included cultural poverty, the systematic destruction of African languages, religions, and social structures. It included educational poverty, forced illiteracy and ignorance. And it included spiritual poverty, the denial of full humanity and dignity. Nat's rebellion addressed all these forms of poverty by asserting the absolute equality and worth of enslaved people, their right to self-determination and violent resistance, their claim to interpret Scripture and know God's will directly without white mediation. In this sense, the rebellion was not just about physical freedom, though that was its immediate goal. It was about reclaiming full humanity, asserting that enslaved people were moral agents, capable of making weighty decisions, religious subjects with direct access to divine truth, historical actors who could shape events rather than merely endure them. This existential claim to full humanity was perhaps the rebellion's most radical and lasting contribution. Even those who condemned the violence had to acknowledge that the rebels were acting from conviction and purpose, not as mindless savages or property gone rogue, but as human beings pursuing what they believed to be right. The faith that motivated Nat Turner continues to challenge comfortable religious narratives. It wasn't the feel-good spirituality that validates existing power structures, or the therapeutic religion that helps people cope with suffering without challenging its sources. It was a demanding, uncomfortable faith that called for sacrifice, that divided families and communities, that led to death and suffering, that forced people to choose sides in a cosmic battle between good and evil, bondage and freedom, the forces of oppression and the forces of liberation. This kind of faith is frightening precisely because it's so powerful, because it can motivate people to do extraordinary things regardless of personal cost. As we approach the conclusion of this remarkable story, we invite you to reflect on the power of faith to drive revolutionary change. If this account has moved you or made you think differently about the relationship between faith and freedom, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it widely. These stories need to be told and retold so we never forget the price that was paid for freedom. The question Nat Turner's life poses to us today is not whether we should engage in violent rebellion. Most of us are not facing the kind of total oppression that enslaved people faced. The question is whether our faith, whatever form it takes, demands anything of us beyond personal comfort and individual salvation. Does it challenge us to confront injustice, even at personal cost? Does it connect our spiritual lives to the material conditions of our neighbors? Does it give us courage to act on our convictions, even when the outcome is uncertain and the cost is high? These are the questions that Nat Turner's example forces us to consider. For those who experienced slavery and its aftermath, Nat Turner represented the unbreakable human spirit, the refusal to accept dehumanization, no matter how complete it appeared. the conviction that freedom was worth dying for. His memory sustained hope through the long years of continued slavery, through the violence of the Civil War, through the broken promises of Reconstruction, through the terrorism of Jim Crow. Each generation found in his story something they needed: proof that resistance was possible, validation that anger at injustice was righteous, assurance that those who fought for freedom would be remembered and honored. The relationship between Nat Turner's faith and his violence remains troubling and important. He was not a secular revolutionary who happened to be religious. His faith was not decoration or rationalization for political goals reached independently. The visions, the biblical interpretation, the sense of divine calling, these were the core of his identity and the engine of his actions. He killed because he believed God commanded it, and he never expressed doubt or regret about that belief. This challenges both those who want to separate faith from politics and those who want to portray religious faith as inherently peaceful. Nat shows us that faith can motivate both tremendous courage and terrible violence, sometimes simultaneously. The poverty that the rebellion addressed was not ended by the rebellion itself. Emancipation came 3 decades later through the Civil War, and economic security for Black Americans remains incomplete even today. But the rebellion was part of a long chain of resistance that made slavery increasingly untenable, that proved enslaved people would never accept their bondage peacefully, that forced slaveholders to invest ever more resources in maintaining a system that was both morally indefensible and economically inefficient in an industrializing world. In this indirect but real way, Nat Turner's faith and action did contribute to eventual liberation from slavery and the opportunity, however incomplete, to escape the poverty that bondage ensured. The story of Nat Turner is not a simple moral tale with clear heroes and villains and obvious lessons. It's a complex, tragic, inspiring, and disturbing story about what happens when human beings are pushed to the absolute limits of endurance, when faith collides with oppression, when the desire for freedom becomes more powerful than the fear of death. It's a story that raises more questions than it answers, and that's appropriate. Easy answers about faith, violence, oppression, and liberation are usually wrong. The truth is complicated, and Nat Turner's life embodies those complications. What remains clear across all the debates and interpretations is that Nat Turner was a man of extraordinary courage and conviction. He believed he was chosen for a great purpose, and he fulfilled what he believed to be his calling, regardless of personal cost. He refused to accept the role that society assigned him, the role of obedient property, and instead claimed the most radical identity possible, a prophet called by God to execute divine judgment. Whether we see him as a hero, a villain, or something more complex, we cannot deny that he was a person of immense will and faith who shaped history through his actions. For the hundreds who died in the rebellion and its aftermath, both the white victims of the rebels and the black victims of the retaliation, Nat Turner's faith came at an unbearable cost. These deaths are tragic, regardless of one's assessment of the rebellion's justification. They remind us that faith, even faith in liberation and justice, does not remove us from the moral complexities of human existence. Nat believed his violence was righteous, but righteous violence still kills real people with families and lives and futures. This is the terrible burden that revolutionaries carry, the weight of the deaths they cause in pursuit of goals they believe are worth that cost. The faith that Nat Turner embodied was relentless, uncompromising, absolute. It allowed for no doubt, no half measures, no comfortable compromises. It demanded everything and accepted nothing less. This kind of faith is rare because most people, quite reasonably, are not willing to sacrifice their lives and the lives of others for abstract principles or long-term goals. Most people accommodate themselves to injustice when the cost of resistance is too high. Nat could not or would not make that accommodation, and that refusal, grounded in his faith, made him both dangerous and historically significant. In the end, Nat Turner's rebellion was a failure in its immediate objectives, but a success in its larger impact. It did not free enslaved people from bondage or poverty in a direct, immediate way, but it demonstrated that enslaved people could organize and fight, that they rejected their enslavement fundamentally, that the system required constant violence to maintain, and that violence could be answered with violence. These demonstrations helped create the conditions for eventual abolition, made slavery a national crisis that demanded resolution, and inspired future generations who continued the struggle for freedom and equality. In these ways, Nat Turner's relentless faith did help free many from slavery and poverty, not through a single miraculous day, but through a long historical process his courage helped set in motion. As we reflect on this complex and powerful story, we are left with enduring questions about the nature of faith, the legitimacy of violence in response to oppression, the price of freedom, and the ways that individual actions ripple through history in unexpected ways. Nat Turner cannot answer these questions for us. Each person must grapple with them according to their own conscience and circumstances. But his life insists that we take these questions seriously, that we recognize the terrible dilemmas faced by those living under systematic oppression, and that we honor the courage of those who risked everything, even when we might question their methods or mourn the consequences of their actions. This is the legacy of Nat Turner, a relentless faith that refused to accept bondage and that continues nearly 2 centuries later to challenge, inspire, and disturb us.